Thank you very much, Richard, and I am delighted to be here in these new headquarters. I have been often to, I guess, the mothership in New York City, but it's good to have an outpost of the council right here down the street from the State Department. We get a lot of advice from the council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future. I mean,
All right, so we're to Chapter 5H, the Tax-exempt foundations, which is a very important piece of this puzzle. Quote, "The Council on Foreign Relations, another member of the international complex, financed by the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations, overwhelmingly propagandizes the globalist concept. This organization became virtually an agency of the government when World War II broke out. The Rockefeller Foundation had started and financed certain studies known as the War and Peace Studies, manned largely by associates of the Council. The State Department, in due course, took these studies over, retaining the major personnel which the Council on Foreign Relations had supplied." Unquote. Renee Wormser, author of Foundations, Their Power and Influence, 1958. Intermarrying between Great Plan family members does well to contribute to keeping their money, and therefore their power, retained within the Illuminati ranks. However, the primary avenue through which the global elites grow and retain their power is through the various tax-free foundations they set up and control. By donating their billions to their tax-free foundations, they give up ownership of the money but still retain all the power that money enables them by directing how their foundations use that money. Not only this, but the media they control hails them as humanitarians, when in fact they are using the money for the exact opposite purposes. Nearly every significant action implemented by the proponents of the Great Plan in the 20th century and beyond to compromise the integrity of American society and seize the reins of world power have been directed and financed, either wholly or partially, through the elite's tax-exempt organizations, which have been brainwashed into public opinion as benefactors of our society. The revolving door cross-pollination that occurs between these pro-New World Order tax-free foundations, the multinational corporations, the New World Order steering groups we will discuss next chapter, and the United States federal government is rampant and treasonous. Although I am just giving a bare-bones summary here, it would only take a couple of hours of your time to research this topic to find what I say is indeed the truth. With the means to loan enormous sums to the government, the Federal Reserve, a method to make payments on the debt, income tax, and an escape from taxation for the wealthy, the tax-free foundations, all that remained in the year 1913 was an excuse for the federal government to start borrowing giant sums of money. By some incredible coincidence, 1 year after the founding of the Fed in 1913, World War I began in 1914, and after American participation, national debt rose from $1 billion to $25 billion. The American public, and therefore their elected officials, at least some of them, began to wake up to the fact that these giant foundations and their billions of dollars worth of influence were not doing the work they were granted tax-free status for, which was to act in the best interest of the country and humanity in general. In 1952, a congressional committee to investigate the tax-free foundations was created, called the Cox Committee, led by Representative Eugene E. Cox, a Democrat from Georgia. Its stated purpose was to find out, quote, which foundations and organizations are using their resources for purposes other than the purposes for which they were established, and especially to determine which such foundations and organizations are using their resources for un-American and subversive activities, or for purposes not in the interest or tradition of the United States, unquote. Cox made the discovery that officers and trustees of some of these suspect foundations were in fact communist, and that grants had been doled out to communist or communist-controlled organizations both in the United States and abroad. Cox coincidentally died during the investigation in December of 1952, and the facts were glossed over in a cover-up by congressmen who were pro-New World Order. Immediately after Cox's death, patriotic members of the 83rd Congress commissioned Congressman B. Carroll Reese in 1953 to continue where Cox had left off and investigate the tax-exempt foundations to determine why they had financed communist organizations. The Reese Committee ended up discovering 1. In 1915, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace launched a propaganda program to force the United States into World War I. 2. Many of our large foundations were actively promoting communism and socialism. 3. The Rockefeller Foundation, financed by Dr. Alfred Kinsey's badly flawed study of human sexuality and his effort to undermine the moral standards of our nation. 4. The Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Education Foundation, and the Ford Foundation had used their grant-making power to take over American education and force our colleges and universities to abandon their religious beliefs and moral standards. 5. The foundations influenced State Department policy and were largely responsible for bringing communism to China. 6. The foundations were working to undermine our constitutional form of government. Reese's special committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations uncovered evidence that foundations were financing civil rights groups, liberal political groups, political extremist groups, and supporting revolutionary activities throughout the world. The committee reported, quote, "Substantial evidence indicates there is more than a mere close working together among some foundations operating in the international field. There is here, as in the general realm of social sciences, a close interlock. The Carnegie Corporation, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Rockefeller Foundation, and recently the Ford Foundation, joined by some others, have commonly cross-financed to a tune of many millions organizations concerned with internationalists, among them the Institute of Pacific Relations, the Foreign Policy Association, and in parentheses, which was virtually a creature of the Carnegie Endowment, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and others. And that it happened by sheer coincidence stretches credulity." Unquote. On August 19, 1954, Reese summed up his investigation with this statement, quote, "It has been said that the foundations are a power second only to that of the federal government itself. Perhaps the Congress should now admit that the foundations have become more powerful, in some areas, at least than the legislative branch of the government." Unquote. The investigation came to an abrupt halt in 1955 after funding was withheld by bought and paid for pro-New World Order congressmen. Rene Wormser, the counsel for the Reese Committee, later wrote, "Foundations, Their Power and Influence." In his book, Wormser says, quote, "The chief motivation in the creation of foundations has long ceased to be pure philanthropy. It is now predominantly tax avoidance. The increasing tax burden on income and estates has greatly accelerated a trend toward creation of foundations as instruments for the retention of control over capital assets that would otherwise be lost." Unquote. According to Representative Wright Patman, a U.S. congressman and chair of the United States House Committee on Banking and Currency, in a report in 1962 to the 87th Congress, it is because of the existence of the elite's foundations that, quote, "only 1/3 of the income of the nation is actually taxed," unquote. The rest of it is dumped tax-free into these Illuminati-controlled organizations to be literally used against us. These accumulations of tax-exempt billions place an even heavier burden on taxpayers. By protecting trillions of dollars from taxation, the tax-exempt organizations thereby force taxpayers to take up the slack in order to bankroll all that the government demands, or at least the interest payments on our federal credit card to the Federal Reserve. All right, so that's the end of that, and that's the end of that chapter, not just the subchapter. And so next time we'll be to Chapter 6, Steering the New World Order. And I'll talk to you then.